The air hung thick with the tang of burnt ozone and oxidized metal in Sector Gamma. Kale wiped grimy sweat from his brow, squinting through the perpetual haze that blanketed Noviridia's forgotten outskirts. His calloused hands, once precision instruments in sterile laboratories, now rummaged through twisted heaps of discarded technology, seeking treasures others had abandoned. Sector Gamma was a labyrinth of technological graves, broken machinery, failed prototypes, and the remnants of Noviridia's endless consumption. The year 2242 had brought marvels to those within the gleaming metropolis at the center, but here at the edges, time seemed suspended in decay. Kale preferred it this way. The isolation suited him. After what happened at Kairos Corp 5 years ago, anonymity was a survival mechanism. Out here, no one asked questions about the haunted look in his eyes or the nightmares that still jolted him awake at night. Drenched in cold sweat, fragments of screams echoing in his mind. He paused, adjusting the filtration mask covering his nose and mouth. Something unusual had caught his attention. A damaged shipping container partially buried beneath a cascade of broken solar panels. What made Kale hesitate wasn't the container itself. Such things were common enough in the junkyard. It was the strange markings along its side, symbols that didn't match any shipping company he'd ever encountered. More curious still were the scorch marks that suggested weapons fire, and the reinforced locking mechanisms that spoke of something valuable or dangerous inside. As he approached, something else registered, a faint sound coming from within. Not mechanical, not the skittering of the rats that had adapted to the toxic environment of Sector Gamma. Something alive. Caution urged him to walk away. Experience had taught him that curiosity was rarely rewarded in the wastelands. And yet he found himself moving closer, his scavenger's instincts warring with a deeper instinct he thought he'd buried years ago: compassion. The lock was sophisticated but damaged. Kale studied it, mentally cataloging the components he'd need to bypass it. Returning to his makeshift tool satchel, he selected a plasma cutter and several electronic bypass modules he'd salvaged last month. This is going to take a while, he muttered to himself, his voice raspy from disuse. The afternoon slipped into evening as Kale worked methodically on the container's security systems. The lockdown mechanisms were military-grade, far beyond standard cargo security. Whatever was inside had been meant to stay there, or at least stay controlled. As night fell, casting long shadows across the junkyard, the weak sounds from inside the container grew more sporadic. Urgency pushed Kale's fingers to work faster. Finally, after bypassing the third security protocol, a pneumatic hiss signaled partial success. One section of the container's side panel slid open just enough to create a narrow gap. Kale aimed his flashlight into the darkness within. The beam caught something that made his breath catch in his throat. Through the gap, a scaled hand, unmistakably not human, reached weakly toward the light. The fingers were long and slender, covered in iridescent scales that shimmered between blue and violet. Where nails should have been, small, dull claws extended. The hand trembled, straining toward the light before falling limply against the container floor. "What the hell?" Kale whispered, stepping back instinctively. His mind raced through possibilities. A genetically engineered weapon? A biological experiment? He'd seen enough of those at Kairos to recognize the hallmarks. The logical choice was to seal the container and walk away. Whatever was inside was dangerous by definition, a complication he didn't need. Yet something about that reaching hand, the desperate, weakening gesture toward light, resonated with a part of himself he thought had died in the laboratories of Kairos. With a muttered curse that was half resignation and half determination, Kale returned to the lock and redoubled his efforts. Another hour passed before the main seal released with a heavy clunk, allowing the side panel to slide open fully. Inside, illuminated by his flashlight beam, lay a creature unlike anything Kale had ever seen. Humanoid in form, but definitely not human. The being appeared female, with a delicate facial structure despite the small horn-like protrusions that extended from her temples. Her skin was covered in fine scales that varied in color from deep blue to violet. with hints of luminescence at their edges. A slender tail, currently limp, extended from her lower back. But what struck Kale most was her condition. She was severely malnourished, her breathing shallow and labored. Restraint marks on her wrists and ankles told a story of captivity. Various injection sites along her arms suggested she had been subjected to tests or chemical control. She wore only a simple, clinical shift garment with faded alphanumeric codes printed on it, an inventory tag rather than clothing. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Kale recognized that this being was likely the product of advanced genetic engineering, possibly incorporating DNA from a species long extinct or never naturally evolved on Earth. The scientist in him cataloged details. The structural reinforcement of her bone visible through translucent scales at her joints, the unusual respiratory patterns, the physiological adaptations that suggested extreme durability. The human in him saw only suffering. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "Can you understand me?" Her eyes flickered open briefly, vertical pupilled, and a startling amber that seemed to glow from within. There was intelligence there, and fear, before they closed again. Kale made his decision without further deliberation. He couldn't leave her here to die, regardless of what she was or where she came from. With careful movements, he gathered the lightweight being into his arms. She was alarmingly light, her body radiating an unusual warmth despite her weakened state. As he carried her away from the container, he glanced back at the interior. The walls were reinforced with heat-resistant materials, and monitoring equipment had been torn from its moorings, evidence of a violent event that had brought the container to Sector Gamma. "Let's get you somewhere safe," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. The journey back to his makeshift home was arduous in the dark. Kale lived in a repurposed transit bus half buried in the junkyard. Its exterior camouflaged to blend with the surrounding debris, but its interior converted into a surprisingly functional living space. Solar panels he'd reclaimed provided limited power, enough for essential needs, and his small collection of salvaged medical equipment, remnants of his former life. Once inside, he gently laid the scaled being on his cot. In the better light, her condition looked even more dire. Malnutrition, dehydration, and multiple half-healed wounds suggested she had been in that container for weeks, perhaps surviving on minimal life support that had eventually failed. Kale worked methodically, first establishing an intravenous line with fluids and nutrients. His medical supplies were limited, but his training remained sharp. He monitored her vital signs as best he could with his jerry-rigged equipment, noting unusual readings that confirmed her non-human physiology. As he worked, a name came to him, Lyra. After the faint constellation he sometimes glimpsed through the perpetual haze above Sector Gamma on the clearest nights. A small tether to beauty in an ugly world. "Lyra," he said softly, testing the name. "I don't know what you are or where you came from, but you're safe now." Hours passed as Kale maintained his vigil. Occasionally, Lyra's body temperature would spike, the scales along her arms glowing faintly before subsiding. Twice she emitted a soft, keening sound that made the hair on Kale's arms stand on end, not from fear, but from an inexplicable resonance that touched something primal in his mind. By morning, her condition had stabilized somewhat. Kale had managed only brief intervals of sleep, jerking awake at every change in her breathing. When her eyes finally opened again, they fixed on him with an intensity that felt almost physical. She tried to move, panic evident in her sudden tension. "Easy," Kale said, raising his hand to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. I found you in a damaged container. You were hurt. I'm trying to help." Her response was a low vibration in her throat that he felt more than heard. She glanced at the foreline, then back at him, her alien features inscrutable. "Water? Are you thirsty?" Kale reached for a container, moving slowly. To his surprise, she nodded, a very human gesture that suggested either remarkable adaptability or prior exposure to humans. Helping her drink was an awkward process, but her desperate thirst was evident. After several cautious sips, she laid back, exhaustion plain in every line of her body. Kale realized communication would be their first major hurdle. He pointed to himself. "Kale," he said clearly. After a moment's hesitation, she mimicked the gesture, pointing to herself, but no sound emerged. Instead, her throat glowed briefly blue beneath the scales. "Lyra," Kale said, giving her the name he'd already assigned in his mind. "I'm going to call you Lyra, if that's okay." Again, that slight nod, her eyes never leaving his face. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Lyra grew stronger with surprising speed, her body's regenerative capabilities far exceeding human norms. By the third day, she was able to sit up unassisted, and by the fifth, she could stand and move around the confined space of the bus. She remained silent, though Kale occasionally caught her mouthing words, as if practicing them when she thought he wasn't looking. Her curiosity was boundless. Every piece of technology, every salvaged item in Kale's collection received intense scrutiny. She seemed particularly fascinated by an old data tablet, her fingers moving across its surface with unexpected familiarity before it activated in ways Kale had never achieved. It was during the second week that Kale noticed they weren't alone anymore. The telltale signs of surveillance drones, quiet, quick movements at the edge of visual range, odd electromagnetic disturbances in his jury-rigged security system, suggested someone was looking for something. Or someone. The realization came with a cold, not a dread. He knew exactly who would be searching for a being like Lyra. That night, as Lyra slept, Kale carefully examined the fragments of container paneling he'd salvaged. Under ultraviolet light, the marking revealed something he'd missed, a faded but unmistakable Kairos Corp identifier code. The same corporation he'd fled 5 years ago after witnessing what their genetic engineering division was willing to do in the name of advancement. Kairos Corporation, the world leader in genetic engineering and biological weapons development. The company that had recruited him for his bioengineering brilliance and then pushed him to cross ethical lines he couldn't uncross. The nightmare he thought he'd escaped. And now, it seemed, they were looking for their lost property. Kale's sleep that night was fitful, haunted by memories of screams behind laboratory doors and the cold eyes of Dr. Thorne, the division head who had calmly explained that ethical concerns were merely evolutionary hesitation to be overcome. He awoke to find Lyra standing over him, her head tilted in what he'd come to recognize as concern. She reached out hesitantly, her scaled fingers hovering just above his forehead before withdrawing. "I'm okay," he assured her, though the lie was transparent. "But we might have trouble coming." The drones returned the next day, more of them, more boldly. From his hidden vantage point, Kale spotted the ground team, 6 figures in the distinctive tactical gear of Kairos security forces, moving with military precision through the junkyard. Their leader, a tall man with a shock of white hair, directed operations with sharp hand gestures. Kale recognized him immediately. Commander Marcus Thorne, Dr. Eris Thorne's younger brother and head of Kairos' Asset Recovery Division. The family resemblance was striking. The same angular features and cold efficiency, though Marcus had channeled his ruthlessness into physical rather than intellectual pursuits. "We need to move," Kale told Lyra urgently upon returning to their shelter. "The people who put you in that container are here. They're looking for you." Lyra's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her pupils contracted to thin slits, and the scales along her arms and neck flared with a blue luminescence. The temperature in the small space rose noticeably as a vibration emanated from her throat. "I won't let them take you," Kale promised, already gathering essential supplies into a backpack. "But we can't stay here." By nightfall, they had abandoned the relative safety of Kale's long-term shelter for the uncertain protection of Neo-Viridia's urban fringe. The transition zone between the junkyard and the city proper was a maze of abandoned industrial complexes and makeshift settlements of those who existed in the margins of society. Kale led them through service tunnels and drainage systems he'd mapped during his years of isolation, avoiding the surveillance networks that blanketed the more developed areas. Lyra followed with surprising agility, her movements becoming more fluid and graceful as her strength returned. In the darkness, her eyes glowed faintly, providing an unexpected advantage as they navigated the lightless passages. It was during their third night on the move that Lyra's abilities manifested in a way Kale couldn't ignore. They'd taken refuge in the basement of a derelict manufacturing facility when a Kairos patrol drone detected their heat signatures. As the drone descended, mechanical arms extending to capture or incapacitate, Lyra stepped in front of Kale. The vibration in her throat intensified, and with a gesture of her hand, a pulse of energy, not quite electricity, not quite heat, disabled the drone instantly. She turned to Kale, her eyes wide with what might have been surprise at her own abilities. "How did you do that?" he whispered, examining the perfectly disabled drone. Its circuits were fried, but there was no external damage. Lyra made a frustrated gesture, clearly wanting to explain, but lacking the words. Instead, she took his hand and pressed it against her throat, where he could feel the vibration building and subsiding. "Some kind of electromagnetic pulse?" he guessed. "Or thermal energy manipulation?" She nodded hesitantly to the second suggestion, then made an expanding gesture with her hands. "It's growing stronger," he realized. "As you recover." Another nod, more certain this time. That night, huddled in their temporary shelter, Kale finally shared his story with her. He wasn't sure how much she understood, but the need to unburden himself overrode the question of comprehension. "I used to work for them, for Kairos," he explained, watching her reaction carefully. "I was a biomedical engineer, specializing in genetic adaptation to extreme environments. I thought we were developing ways to help humanity survive on other worlds." He laughed bitterly. "I was naive." Lyra watched him intently, her head slightly tilted. "The project I was assigned to was called Genesis. Not like the biblical creation. This was about creating life forms that could terraform hostile environments in advance of human colonization. But Dr. Eris Thorne had other ideas. He saw the potential for weapons, living weapons that could destabilize enemy infrastructure or eliminate populations without a direct fingerprint back to the deployers." Kale's hands shook slightly at the memory. "When I realized what was happening, I tried to stop it. I reported my concerns through official channels, but Kairos doesn't tolerate whistleblowers. They were going to reassign me to a deep space research station, which is corporate speak for making someone disappear. So I ran, destroyed as much of my research as I could on the way out." He looked directly at Lyra. "I think you might be part of a similar project. Something called Draconis, based on the markings on your container. I never worked directly on it, but there were rumors, theories about adapting extinct species DNA for modern applications. Dragon myths appear in cultures worldwide for a reason, some scientists believed. What if those creatures were real once? What if their genetic material could be recovered and modified?" Lyra's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Her scales rippled with a wave of bioluminescence, and she nodded slowly, deliberately. "You understand more than you can say," Kale realized. "You know what you are." She made a gesture of uncertainty, a too-human shrug that seemed out of place with her exotic physiology. "We need to keep moving," Kale said, returning to practical concerns. "Commander Thorne won't give up easily. Assets like you are worth billions to Kairos, especially if you've demonstrated the abilities I suspect you have." The next day brought them deeper into the Undercity, the neglected infrastructure beneath Neo-Viridia's gleaming towers. Here, ancient maintenance tunnels connected to newer systems in a labyrinthine network that even the city's advanced tracking systems couldn't fully monitor. It was in this twilight world that Lyra spoke her first word. They had paused to rest in a junction chamber, the distant hum of the city's power grid vibrating through the walls. Kale was checking their meager supplies when a soft, melodic voice broke the silence. "Kale." He turned, startled, to find Lyra watching him intently. Her throat glowed faintly as she repeated, "Kale," the sound carrying harmonic undertones that no human voice could produce. "Yes," he said, amazement temporarily replacing exhaustion. "That's right. Kale." She pointed to herself. "Lyra," she said, accepting the name he'd given her. "You can speak," he said unnecessarily. "Learning," she replied, the word coming out with careful precision. "Difficult. Different. Mechanisms." Her speech had an otherworldly musical quality, vowels carrying secondary tones like overlapping notes in a chord. "Take your time," Kale encouraged her. "We have." The words died in his throat as distant footsteps echoed through the tunnels, the unmistakable sound of tactical boots moving in formation. "They found us," he whispered. "We need to move. Now." But it was too late. As they gathered their belongings, the junction chamber's exits suddenly filled with armored figures, weapons trained on them. Commander Marcus Thorne stepped forward, his white hair stark against the black tactical gear. "Cale Varden," he said, his voice carrying the same cold precision his brother was known for. "Asset thief. What an unexpected bonus." His gaze shifted to Lyra. "An Asset X-7, still functional despite your unauthorized liberation. Dr. Thorne will be pleased." Cale moved instinctively to place himself between Lyra and the Kairos forces. "She's not an asset," he said, anger overcoming fear. "She's a living being." Marcus laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Philosophical distinctions don't alter legal status, Varden. The creature is Kairos property, the culmination of 15 years of research and an investment exceeding the GDP of small nations. Step aside." "No." The word came not from Cale, but from Lyra, her voice resonating with unexpected power through the chamber. Marcus's expression flickered briefly to surprise before settling into calculated assessment. "It's speaking now. Interesting development. Note that Jensen," he said to one of his subordinates. "Spontaneous language acquisition without the control protocols. Last warning, Varden," Marcus continued, his weapon raising. "Step aside or we'll take you both in. You for industrial espionage, the asset for recommissioning." What happened next occurred too quickly for Cale to fully process. As Marcus stepped forward, Lyra moved with blinding speed, placing herself in front of Cale. The temperature in the chamber spiked dramatically as energy rippled visibly across her scales. With a sound like a compressed thunderclap, a wave of force erupted from her, knocking the tactical team off their feet. "Run," she told Cale, her voice strained with effort as she maintained the energy field separating them from their pursuers. They fled through the momentary chaos, Lyra's unexpected display of power giving them precious seconds of advantage. Behind them, Marcus barked orders for non-lethal capture protocols. "This way," Cale gasped, pulling Lyra toward a maintenance shaft he'd noticed earlier. The narrow passage would slow their armored pursuers. As they ran, Cale processed what he'd just witnessed. Lyra's abilities were far beyond his initial assessment. Some form of energetic manipulation that suggested her dragon DNA wasn't merely cosmetic, but functional. The implications were staggering and terrifying if Kairos managed to weaponize such abilities. They emerged into a vast hydroponics chamber, long abandoned but still structurally intact. Massive growth beds stretched before them, once used to cultivate food for the city above, but now hosting only wild, mutated variants of the original crops, thriving in the artificial environment. "We need to stop," Cale said, noting Lyra's exhaustion. The energy expenditure had clearly taken a toll. Her scales dulled and her breathing labored. Just for a minute, to think. They concealed themselves among the overgrown vegetation as Cale assessed their options. The tactical team would be regrouping, possibly calling in reinforcements. Direct confrontation was suicide. "Understand. More now," Lyra said haltingly, her voice weaker than before. "When using power, memories return." Cale looked at her sharply. "You remember? About Project Draconis?" She nodded. "Not all. Fragments. Pain. Others like me. Failed. Other subjects," Cale translated grimly. "That didn't survive the process. Last," she confirmed. "Only successful. Integration. Dragon and something else. Not from here." The implications sent a chill through Cale. Not just extinct terrestrial DNA, then, but possibly extraterrestrial material. The ethical boundaries Kairos had crossed were even more profound than he'd feared. "Dr. Thorne," Lyra continued, her speech becoming more fluid with practice. His voice, in pain sleep, saying, weapon, saying, evolution leap. They were conditioning you, Kale realized, even in stasis, programming you. Before they could continue the conversation, the distant sound of approaching forces reached them. They'd been found again. We can't keep running, Kale said, desperation edging into his voice. They have the resources to track us indefinitely. Lyra's expression shifted to one of determination. Central Place, she said, where information lives. Proof of what they did. Cairo's headquarters? Kale asked, incredulous. That's suicide. It's the most secure building in Neo-Viridia. Not headquarters. Research facility. Where I was made. Have to show world. Her eyes met his, fierce with purpose. Stop them making more. Free others if they exist. Kale wanted to argue, but found he couldn't. She was right. Running would only end one way eventually. Their only hope was to expose Cairo's, to make Lyra too public to disappear. I know where it would be, he said finally. The Cairo's Genomics Research Center in Sector 5. It's where all their classified projects are housed. But getting in, I can help, came a new voice from behind them. Kale whirled, reaching for the makeshift weapon in his pack. But Lyra laid a restraining hand on his arm. Not enemy, she said with certainty. The figure that emerged from the shadows was an elderly woman, her dark skin webbed with wrinkles that spoke of a long life in harsh conditions. She wore the piecemeal clothing typical of the Undercity dwellers, but her posture and clear gaze suggested a different background. My name is Alara, she said, former systems architect for Genex Corporation, before Cairo's absorbed it 8 years ago. She looked at Lyra with undisguised wonder. I've been tracking your energy signatures since you entered the Undercity. Quite distinctive. Quite beautiful. Why would you help us? Kale demanded, suspicious. Alara's expression hardened. Because I've seen what Cairo's does to those who oppose them. Because I lost my daughter to their confidentiality protocols when she discovered irregularities in their genomic research data. She turned to Lyra. And because any being capable of the compassion I've observed in your interactions deserves freedom, regardless of origin. You've been watching us? Kale asked, alarmed. The Undercity has its own surveillance network, Alara explained. Those of us who live here by choice rather than circumstance maintain it. A parallel system the corporations don't know about. She gestured for them to follow. We don't have much time. I can offer temporary sanctuary and perhaps a way into the Genomic Center. But we must move quickly. Thorne's forces will have called in aerial support by now. Alara led them through hidden passages that Kale, despite his years in the margins of Neo-Viridia, had never discovered. Eventually, they emerged into a surprisingly well-equipped living space. A repurposed water purification chamber converted into something between a hacker's den and a comfortable home. Welcome to the Nexus, Alara said, activating systems with practice gestures. One of several safe hubs for those of us who prefer to live beyond corporate surveillance. As displays illuminated around them, Kale saw evidence of a sophisticated operation. Data streams from throughout the city, surveillance feeds, communication intercepts. This was far more than a simple hideout. Your resistance, he realized. We prefer accountability forces, Alara corrected with a thin smile. Less dramatic, more accurate. We document corporate overreach and occasionally correct the balance. She turned to Lyra, her expression softening. May I? She asked, gesturing toward a scanning device. Lyra hesitated, then nodded. The scan took only seconds. Remarkable, Alara breathed, studying the results. Your cellular structure? It's unlike anything I've ever seen. Multiple DNA helixes, some conforming to no known pattern. And your energy signatures, they don't match any documented paradigm. Can you help us? Kale interrupted, aware that time was running short. Alara refocused. Yes, but first, you need rest and proper nutrition. Especially you, she said to Lyra. Your energy expenditure has depleted your reserves dangerously. The next hours were a blur of planning and preparation. Alara provided specialized nutrient solutions for Lyra that seemed to rapidly restore her strength. Meanwhile, they studied the Genomic Center security protocols using data Alara had accumulated over years of surveillance. There's a maintenance access point here, she explained, highlighting a section of the schematic. Used for autonomous cleaning drones. It bypasses most of the biometric checkpoints, but you'll still need to overcome internal security measures. Once we're in, what exactly are we looking for? Kale asked. Project Draconis Files, Lyra said with newfound confidence. Her speech had become increasingly fluid over the hours, as if the right neural pathways were finally connecting. The truth of what I am, what they intended, and, she hesitated, whether there are others. The central data core would have everything, Ilera confirmed, but it's air-gapped from external networks as a security measure. You'll need physical access to download the files. And once we have them, Kale asked, I can broadcast them globally, Ilera said. Through channels, even Kairos can't shut down quickly enough. Make them too public to bury. She looked at them both seriously. But understand what you're risking. Kairos doesn't just sue whistleblowers, they erase them. Even with evidence public, you'll never be truly safe unless Kairos itself falls. I've been running for 5 years, Kale said quietly. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder. And I, Lyra added, was never meant to live free. Better to die fighting than return to being property. The infiltration plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity. Using Ilera's underground connections, they secured maintenance worker identifications that would get them into the outer perimeter of the Genomics Center. From there, they would access the service tunnels and make their way to the central data core. What they couldn't plan for was the response once they were detected, and detection was inevitable. At that point, Lyra's abilities would be their primary defense as Kale worked to extract the data. The morning of their operation, Ilera provided them with final equipment, communications devices, specialized tools for bypassing security systems, and a powerful data extraction module. One more thing, she said, presenting Lyra with what appeared to be a simple pendant. This will help stabilize your energy output. I notice fluctuations that might be causing you pain or limiting precise control. Lyra accepted the gift with evident emotion, the scales around her eyes shimmering with a soft blue light that Kale had come to recognize as her version of tears. Thank you, she said simply. Come back alive, Ilera told them both. The world needs more people willing to stand for truth, no matter their species. Their approach to the Genomics Center went exactly as planned, a rarity that made Kale increasingly nervous. They passed through the service entrance with their borrowed credentials, the facial recognition systems accepting the subtle holographic overlays Ilera had provided. The maintenance tunnels were sterile and automated, patrolled only by simple security drones that accepted their worker credentials without issue. It wasn't until they reached the inner security perimeter that they encountered their first human guard. Maintenance authorization? The guard asked, barely looking up from his station. Kale presented the forged documentation, tense but outwardly calm. The guard scanned it, frowned slightly, then looked more closely at them both. This sector isn't scheduled for maintenance today, he said, hand moving subtly toward his sidearm. Before Kale could respond, Lyra stepped forward. The scales along her throat glowed momentarily as she spoke, her voice carrying unusual harmonics. Emergency protocol override. Contamination detected in Section 7G air filtration. The guard's expression went blank for a moment, then relaxed. Right. Section 7G. Go ahead. He pressed the access control, opening the security door. How did you do that? Kale whispered once they were past. Sound manipulation, Lyra explained, looking somewhat surprised herself. Harmonic patterns affect human neurological processes. I remembered how. More of your conditioning coming back. She nodded grimly. Designed to influence, to control, to infiltrate. The revelation of how Kairos had intended to use her abilities sent a fresh wave of determination through Kale. They moved quickly through the restricted research sectors, avoiding personnel where possible, with Lyra occasionally using her harmonic voice to overcome obstacles. The central data core was housed in a circular chamber at the heart of the facility. Unlike the sterile white of the rest of the complex, this room was a stark black, lit only by the blue glow of massive data storage units. A single-access terminal stood at its center, surrounded by a transparent security barrier. Standard biometric authentication, Kale observed. DNA retinal, voice print. Can you bypass it? Lyra asked. No, he admitted. But I don't have to. He removed a small device from his pack, one of his own design, created years ago while still employed by Kairos. This mimics Dr. Eris Thorne's biometric signatures. I developed it as emergency backup when I was planning my exit. Never had to use it. Why did you make this? Lyra asked, curious despite the urgency. Kale's expression darkened. Because even then, I suspected I might someday need to expose what he was doing. The ethical compromises started small, but they grew. I want an insurance policy. He activated the device, holding it against the security scanner. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft chime, the barrier deactivated. Welcome, Dr. Thorne, the system announced. They worked quickly, Kale navigating the data architecture while Lyra stood guard. The Project Draconis files were even more extensive than they had anticipated. Thousands of documents detailing genetic sequencing, behavioral conditioning protocols, and performance benchmarks. They were creating a diplomatic weapon, Kale said in horror as he skimmed the files. A being that could infiltrate highest-level negotiations through harmonic mind influence, then eliminate targets without conventional weapons if necessary. Not just weapon, Lyra added, reading over his shoulder with unexpected speed. Template. For Army. Look, she pointed to schematics showing production scaling, with projections for hundreds of beings like her. And this, she continued, her voice catching. Others before me. Failed integrations. Dozens. The images were clinical but unmistakable. Failed subjects with partial transformations, bodies rejecting the genetic modifications. We're taking all of it, Kale decided, initiating a complete data transfer to their extraction module. The download had reached 70% when alarms suddenly blared throughout the facility. Security breach detected, the system announced. Unauthorized access to classified materials. Containment protocols initiated. Someone recognized us, Kale realized, working frantically to speed the download. Or they detected the biometric spoofer. Hurry, Lyra urged, positioning herself between Kale and the entrance. They're coming. The download reached 85% as the first security team arrived, for armed guards led by a security officer. They froze momentarily at the sight of Lyra, whose scales had begun to glow with increasing intensity, a visible energy field forming around her. Stand down and surrender the asset, the officer ordered, weapon raised. I am not an asset, Lyra replied, her voice carrying a harmonic pattern that made the guards wince. I am Lyra. What followed was chaos. The guards opened fire with stun weapons, the energy bolts dissipating harmlessly in the field surrounding Lyra. She responded with precise energy pulses that disabled their weapons without harming the personnel themselves. 95%, Kale called out, watching the download progress. The security officer, realizing conventional weapons were ineffective, activated a device on his wrist. Immediately, Lyra staggered, her energy field fluctuating. Neural disruptor, the officer explained with grim satisfaction. Specifically calibrated for your unique brainwave patterns, X7. Did you think we wouldn't have countermeasures for our own creation? Lyra fought against the effect, her form hunching in pain, but her determination unbroken. Not your creation, she gasped. My own self. With visible effort, she straightened, her eyes blazing with amber light. The Penalera had given her glowed in response, stabilizing the fluctuations in her energy field. With a gesture that seemed to tear the very air, Lyra sent a concentrated energy pulse at the officer's device, destroying it. Download complete, Kale announced, removing the data module. More security forces were converging on their position. Their escape route was rapidly closing. We need another way out, Kale said urgently. Lyra looked upward toward the ventilation system. There, she decided. With another energy pulse, she blasted open the reinforced grating. They climbed into the ventilation shaft, just as Commander Marcus Thorne arrived with a heavily armed tactical team. Lock down all environmental systems, he ordered coldly. Flood the ventilation with suppression gas. They crawled rapidly through the narrow shafts, guided by the facility schematics Kale had memorized. Behind them, they could hear the hiss of gas being released into the system. Hold your breath, Kale warned as the first tendrils of the mist reached them. It's a paralytic compound. Lyra nodded, but instead of holding her breath, she inhaled deeply. To Kale's astonishment, the scales along her throat glowed bright blue, and when she exhaled, her breath seemed to neutralize the advancing gas. Another ability? He asked in wonder. Chemical processing, she explained between breaths. Part of infiltration design. Can neutralize toxins, but not indefinitely. They reached an external vent after what seemed like hours of desperate crawling. The reinforced grating here was even stronger, designed to prevent exactly the kind of escape they were attempting. I can break it, Lyra said, gathering her energy. But it will alert them to our location. Do it, Kale decided. We just need to stay ahead of them long enough to transmit the data. With a concentrated blast, Lyra shattered the grating. They emerged onto an exterior maintenance platform, 40 stories above the ground. The city of Neoviridia spread before them, gleaming towers and darkened undercity, creating a stark visual representation of the society's division. The transmission point Alara gave us is 10 blocks from here, Kale said, activating his communication device. Alara, we have the data. Heading to transmission point Alpha. Only Static answered him. They're jamming communications, he realized. We're on our own. The descent from the platform was harrowing, utilizing maintenance ladders and exterior utility conduits. Twice they had to hide from security drones deployed to search for them. By the time they reached ground level, Cairo's security forces had established a perimeter around the facility. We'll never make it through their cordon, Kale said, despair threatening to overwhelm him. Lyra studied the situation, her alien eyes taking in details human vision might miss. Underground, she suggested. Access there. She pointed to a maintenance hatch half-hidden beneath decorative vegetation. They slipped through moments before a security patrol passed, finding themselves in yet another layer of Neoviridia's complex infrastructure, water reclamation tunnels that predated the Genomic Center. Their journey through the Undercity was a blur of narrow escapes and tense moments. Twice they encountered Cairo's search teams that had anticipated their route. Each time, Lyra's abilities, growing stronger and more controlled with each use, provided their salvation. When they finally reached the transmission point, a nondescript utility building that concealed one of Alara's communication hubs, they found it seemingly abandoned. Something's wrong, Kale said, instincts honed by years of survival, screaming warnings. Alara should be here. They entered cautiously, finding the equipment intact, but no sign of their ally. The transmission system was operational, awaiting only the data module and activation. Perhaps she was delayed, Lyra suggested, though her tone indicated she shared Kale's concern. Kale connected the data module, his fingers flying across the interface as he prepared the transmission. Once I activate this, the data goes to every major news outlet, regulatory agency, and public information repository simultaneously. Kairos won't be able to contain it. As his hand moved to the activation control, a familiar voice stopped him cold. Such a waste of potential, Varden. You always did lack vision. They turned to find Dr. Eris Thorne standing in the doorway, flanked by his brother Marcus and 4 tactical officers. Unlike the security forces they'd encountered before, these men wore the distinctive gray uniforms of Cairo's elite Internal Resolution Division, corporate executioners. Where's Alara? Kale demanded. Your accomplice is receiving the best medical care Cairo's can provide, Eris said with clinical detachment. Her knowledge of our systems is impressive, if misapplied. We have much to learn from her. Lyra stepped forward protectively, energy already gathering around her form. You will not take us. Dr. Thorne regarded her with the cold curiosity of a scientist observing an experiment. X7, or Lyra, as you've designated yourself. Your development exceeds all projections. The autonomy, The control over your abilities, the language acquisition, remarkable achievements. I'm not your achievement, Lyra responded, her voice carrying harmonics that made the tactical officers shift uncomfortably. I am my own being. A philosophical position without legal standing, Eris dismissed. You are Cairo's intellectual property, the culmination of 15 years of research and billions in investment. She's a living, sentient being, Kale argued, with rights that supersede any patent claim. Eris laughed softly. Always the idealist, Varden. It's why you were valuable in early-stage research, but unsuitable for application development. He gestured toward the transmission system. Step away from the console. There's no outcome here where that data leaves this room. Kale's hand hovered over the activation control. You're wrong. The only question is whether I live to see it happen. Eris nodded to his brother. Commander, neutralize Varden. Recover X-7 intact. The tactical team raised their weapons. Not stun devices, but lethal firearms loaded with specialized ammunition designed to penetrate energy fields. What happened next occurred in a blur of motion and light. As Marcus gave the fire order, Lyra moved with inhuman speed, placing herself between the tactical team and Kale. Energy erupted from her in a concentrated wave, not aimed at the personnel, but at their weapons, which superheated instantly, forcing the officers to drop them. Simultaneously, she generated a protective barrier around Kale and the transmission console. Activate it, she urged. Now! Kale slammed his hand onto the control. The system came to life, indicators showing the data package being processed for transmission. Transmission initiating, the system announced. Global distribution in 30 seconds. No! Eris shouted, his composure cracking for the first time. He pulled a device from his pocket. A small cylinder with a glowing core. Protocol Omega X7, neural override sequence initiated. The device emitted a pattern of sounds and lights that caused Lyra to falter, her energy field fluctuating wildly. Her scales darkened as she fell to her knees, fighting against the programmed response. Return to baseline programming, Eris commanded. Shut down all autonomous functions. Kale watched in horror as Lyra struggled against the conditioning, her form convulsing with the effort of resistance. The tactical officers were regrouping, drawing secondary weapons. Transmission in 20 seconds, the system announced. Lyra, Kale called. Fight it. You're more than their programming. Her eyes found his, the amber light flickering but not extinguishing. Kale, she managed, her voice distorted by the conflicting imperatives in her mind. Eris increased the device's output. Fascinating resistance, but futile. The override protocols are hardwired into your very DNA. X7. You cannot defy your fundamental programming. Transmission in 10 seconds. Marcus and his team had recovered enough to take aim at the console itself, preparing to destroy it before transmission completed. My name, Lyra said, her voice strengthening despite the device's influence, is Lyra. With visible agony but indomitable will, she straightened. And I define my own programming. In a surge of power that made the very air crackle with energy, Lyra broke free of the override's influence. The pendant Alara had given her glowed with blinding intensity, apparently amplifying her natural resistance. With a focused gesture, she sent a precise energy pulse at Eris's device, shattering it. Transmission complete, the system announced. Global distribution successful. The expression on Eris Thorne's face transformed from scientific detachment to pure rage. Fire, he ordered his brother. Destroy them both. But before the tactical team could act, the building systems suddenly activated, security protocols engaging without human command. Barriers dropped between the Thorns and their targets, while emergency lighting bathed the room in red. What's happening? Marcus demanded, attempting to override the security systems. A familiar voice emanated from the communication system, Alara's voice. Insurance policy activated, she announced. Welcome to my fail-safe, gentlemen. Did you really think I wouldn't anticipate capture? Monitoring screens throughout the facility activated, showing news feeds already picking up the Draconis files. Headlines scrolled across displays. Cairo's Corp human rights violations exposed. Illegal genetic experimentation documented. Corporate atrocities unveiled. "You've lost, Dr. Thorne," Cale said, watching the man's face contort with fury. "The truth is out." "This changes nothing," Eris snarled. "Kairos has weathered scandals before. We own the regulatory agencies, the courts, the media executives. This will be contained." "Not this time," Ilara's voice countered. "These files weren't just sent to media outlets. They went to every competing corporation's research division, every independent scientific ethics committee, every sovereign nation's intelligence agency. The scale of your violations ensures intervention, even from those usually willing to look the other way. The illegal integration of non-terrestrial genetic material alone violates 17 international treaties." Through the barrier, they watched as Eris and Marcus received urgent communications. The brothers' expressions shifted from confidence to alarm. "The board is convening an emergency session," Marcus reported, reading from his communication device. "We're ordered to stand down and return immediately." "Disregard," Eris snapped. "The assets are no longer your concern," a new voice interrupted through their communication system. "Commander Thorne, Dr. Thorne, this is Chairwoman Vate. Your authorization is revoked, effective immediately. Return to headquarters for deposition. Security forces will withdraw from your current location now." With visible reluctance, Marcus ordered his team to stand down. As they departed, Eris fixed Cale and Lyra with a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over," he promised. "Not while I breathe." When they were alone, the security barriers retracted. Ilara's voice returned, weaker now. "I apologize for not being there in person. My capture was unfortunate, but not unanticipated." "Are you all right?" Cale asked urgently. "Where are you?" "Cairo's medical facility," she replied. "Their hospitality leaves much to be desired, but I'll survive." More importantly, the insurance policy worked. "The data is public, and my own evidence of Cairo's broader crimes has also been released." "What happens now?" Lyra asked, her energy field finally stabilizing as she recovered from the override attempt. "Now," Ilara said, "you run. The exposure will devastate Cairo's, possibly destroy it, but that will take time. The Thorns and others will seek vengeance before they fall. You need to disappear until the dust settles." "Where?" Cale asked. "Return to Sector Gamma," Ilara suggested. "With the focus on Cairo's headquarters and research facilities, the outskirts will be overlooked. Find your old shelter, gather supplies, then head east beyond the city limits. There are communities there, free from corporate control, who would welcome beings committed to truth and justice." "What about you?" Lyra asked with concern. "Don't worry about me," Ilara assured them. "I've outlived my projected lifespan by 20 years already, and I have my own extraction plan. We'll meet again when it's safe." The journey back to Sector Gamma was surprisingly uneventful. As Ilara had predicted, Cairo's forces had been recalled to deal with the corporate crisis, leaving the outskirts unpatrolled. The global distribution of the Draconis files had created a media firestorm that occupied all corporate resources. When they reached Cale's old shelter, they found it untouched since their hasty departure. As they gathered supplies for their journey beyond Noviridia, Lyra paused, looking thoughtfully around the repurposed bus that had been her first place of safety. "We could stay here," she suggested unexpectedly. "Make this place more than shelter. Make it home." Cale looked at her in surprise. "Here? In the junkyard?" "Not just junkyard," she explained, her speech now fluid and confident. "Sanctuary. For others like me, if they exist. For beings who don't fit in Neo-Viridia. For truth-tellers running from corporations." The idea took root in Cale's mind, expanding with unexpected appeal. A haven in the last place they'd look, he mused. Using the very things they discarded against them. Building new from old. Lyra agreed. Healing what was broken. As dawn broke over Sector Gamma, they stood together on a small rise overlooking the vast junkyard. Where Cale had once seen only desolation and decay, he now glimpsed possibility. The first rays of sunlight caught on the metallic surfaces of discarded technology, transforming the wasteland into a sea of glittering potential. Sanctuary, he said, testing the word. I like it. Lyra's scales shimmered with iridescent blue in the morning light, her amber eyes bright with purpose. Beginning, she corrected gently. Not end. Together, they turned to face the rising sun. The fugitive scientist and the dragon girl who had defied her creators, silhouetted against the dawn of a new day and the promise of a world where truth had prevailed, however briefly, against power. In the distance, the gleaming towers of Neo-Viridia stood as a reminder of what they had escaped. But here, among the discarded remains of a society that valued novelty over sustainability, they would build something lasting. A haven for the forgotten, a home for the different, a sanctuary for all who sought freedom. And perhaps, someday, much more.